So welcome everyone to our Friday Transportation Seminar. Because we had some technical difficulties getting started, so I'm going to do very quick introductions. We have two great presentations today from two of our outstanding graduate students here at Portland State in our master's students in our civil engineering program. So first up, we're going to have Catherine Keeling presenting her research on e-grocery home delivery impacts on food access and equity. And second, following her, we're going to have Gabby Abuzeh from also the civil engineering program here at Portland State University, and she's going to be presenting her work on a preliminary overview of freight and travel demand at multifamily apartment buildings in Portland, Oregon. So first, Catherine will present, and we'll have time for a few questions after Catherine's presentation, and then we'll turn it over to Gabby. So without further ado, here we go. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Catherine, and work with Dr. Figliosi. This is my presentation on e-grocery. When you step on and off your map, it's zooming in on e-grocery home delivery. All right, so the perspectives I bring to e-grocery, before I went back to school, I actually worked at a grocery store. I was a florist and also the produce buyer for a while. And whenever the leadership would round us up and give us our periodic pep talk for customer service, they were actually very grounded about it and just reminded us that grocery trips are for everybody. They're routine. Let's make this as painless as possible. And so that also is an attitude I bring to this study of e-grocery trends. Grocery trips are highly routine and they're very essential. And so from a transportation perspective, we're really interested in trips that connect people with healthy food. My first went in with a food access challenge, actually happened in 2010, as well before Lyft and Uber, and it was just me, a backpack, and a transit pass. And it was the first time I was wholly reliant on public transportation. So I know personally that any adult can find themselves with a sudden food access challenge, and I am happy to tell you that the tools available are changing. We all know that e-commerce is booming, but e-grocery is still one of the least saturated markets. E-grocery in general encompasses 3 channels. Click and collect is when you would order online and then the consumer still drives to the retail store and picks up the groceries. Subscription services like HelloFresh bring parcels to your doorstep. And this is going to focus on home delivery. It's speculated to grow the most. And has the most interesting implications for urban freight, in my opinion. So the existing research on this has looked at the extent of the market shift, the efficiency of it, especially in VMT, the impacts on urban infrastructure. Again, Gabby will be talking about those trips. And also the potential for autonomous vehicle delivery to be used. For the purpose of this study, again, looking at food access, food equity, and tying in e-grocery home delivery's role and existing investigation and thought on food deserts. So of course, not every home is eligible for home delivery, and so we just want to look at who's in and who is out. So to introduce the food desert concept, it actually dates as old as the early 1990s in Scotland. It came about in public housing discussions. And then HSM from the UK published a report that really got academics from various countries looking at the link between someone's location and their health outcomes. And further research explored the adverse health outcomes that were disproportionately showing in racial and ethnic neighborhoods. And it really caught a lot of attention and ultimately became part of a US federal program called the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. And they provided one-time financing for grocery stores to open up a new storefront in underserved areas, as defined by the USDA. Low access, low income was based on census data, and as far as access, it was based on Euclidean geometric geometries. If there was a store, or in urban context, if there was no store within a mile of that circus tract or census tract, that was considered to be low access, and for rural areas, within 10 miles. So again, with that adoption trend in e-grocery as in the background, the food financing happens. They do follow-up surveys to see like what difference did it make investing in adding more grocery stores into underserved areas. And they actually found that the geographic proximity was a weak determinant of people's food choice. And so scholars continue to keep looking, keep digging out for what is causing these disproportionate health outcomes. So food desert is actually kind of a dated term, at least in academic circles. You might see great research coming out about food mirages, food access priority areas, food apartheid. That's still ongoing. And then in 2019, there's an intersection between trying to further food access to vulnerable groups and policy. So in New York, SNAP clients were able for the first time to use their electronic benefit transfer cards to purchase from 3 major retailers online. So that pilot has gone through. In 2020, it has been extended to 1 more state, Washington. So hopefully that case mix up. I did want to take a moment to mention that when I'm talking about equity, we're going to be focusing on equity from consumer perspective. There is a lot of interesting literature out there about the equity nature of these business models. Most home delivery companies are based on independent contractors. California is rolling out AB 5, looking at like worker misclassification, and there's still pending class action lawsuits. So that really changed the nature of this industry, and I wanted to mention that, but that's current research still. This is Portland, guys, and it's actually the Portland, Vancouver, Hillsborough Metropolitan Statistical Area. It's huge. Okay, so for some context, and every bit of land is placed into one of these descriptors by the Census Bureau. And so what's good about selecting this at our study areas, because there is data available on the demographics at this level, and also we aren't so close into a Portland metro, we can see how this affects those living in the urban core out to the suburban and even rural areas. There's about 2.4 million residents in this area, and about 5% of them live in one of these identified low-income, low-access areas. On this map is shown in purple. I had to tweak with this map to show something didn't happen right. Anyways, there are some food deserts in central Portland area, but sorry, I guess they're covered up by dots. But even in dense areas, there are some. And then, not surprisingly, there's some food access issues when you get out to more rural areas. The upper right corner looks pretty dire. That's a lot of orange, but there are actually no people living in Skamania County. So please don't be dissuaded by the proportion of orange. It's about 5% of people in the area. So there are 4 major e-grocery companies that we looked at. 3 of them have defined their service areas by zip code boundaries. So I queried all of those. We'll talk about the fourth company in a moment. Also, companies like Instacart and Shipt, if you are using their services, you would have more than one option of retailer, and that is important for the consumer experience. So we noted that. This is the Instacart service area. They have more than 8 partners, and you can see that in Central Portland and Beaverton, you have up to 13 retailer choices. But even if you're living as far out as Gaston or Forest Grove, you would still have, access to one retailer, even in these very low density population areas. So that was very surprising to me, just the extent of their service area. I couldn't even stop myself at the service bounds and just kept clicking until I found where it ended. So you can see that they've actually taken markets out to the college towns in Oregon and even some small beach towns. That was interesting. This is Shipt. They were started in Burlington as a grocery home delivery service that they've been bought by Target. And you can see that they have less retailer options, but still reaching out beyond Portland, beyond Beaverton, into the surrounding suburbs. Of course, Amazon Prime Now, they have, this is their service area, and I've shown the locations of the Whole Foods that could potentially be used as fulfillment centers for their Whole Foods grocery orders. And Walmart is the company that does not disclose very much information at all. They don't define their service on a zip code resolution. In fact, you can only just type in one address at a time and it tells you if you're eligible or not. So queried over 500 addresses. The ones eligible for service are shown in the lavender symbol, and not ineligible are with the X. And so you can see that even in Central Portland, some of the densest, most high income areas actually do not have access to a Walmart home delivery. I've dated all of these maps because all these things can change, but this is as recent as March 2019. So if you're living in the Mississippi area, you can't order from Walmart. If you're living in Lake Oswego, you can't order from Walmart. But if you're living out in Gresham, you likely can. And when I added the store locations on the map, it appears that, yes, their service industry correlates with the location of the actual stores, though it doesn't look like every single store is fitted to be a fulfillment center.
To interrupt when I'm doing it, it's just the weight transfer.
Thank you. And what is impressive is that 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart. So again, that's how many stores they have, and they have the most individual stores that can work as fulfillment centers. Pricing. So of course, these companies, it's hard to compare, to figure out what might be the best deal for your situation, whether you want to just use this service only in emergencies or become a regular user of it. So it's very difficult to compare. Again, these are summer 2019, and some of the companies want you to make a yearly or even monthly membership. Some of them, you don't have to have a membership, you can just pay per trip. But it is difficult to sort out which one is the best value for your needs. As far as potential equity gains and people it could serve, the American Blind Association is very supportive of this new technology because grocery trips can be very difficult. And unfortunately, Americans with disabilities still have stunted access to digital technology, and I feel like most apps and interface design are still catching up and developing new best practices on how to enable those with visual impairments to sort through large inventories on the tiny touchscreen. As far as aging, there are many aging seniors in this country who have not planned for driving cessation, been part of their life for many years, and people who work in gerontology consistently say that transportation needs are the #1 unprepared problem. And so while there's been some volunteer nonprofits that just try to help get seniors to grocery stores, this could potentially be a more self-sustaining method. There are still well-documented research on time poverty, especially in single working parent households or double working parent households. And still in most developed countries, women are still tasked with a disproportionate amount of responsibility for household pets. Also, users depending on public transportation with children, a grocery trip would be very difficult because for most metropolitan areas, the stroller policy is that they must be folded. So imagine having your children holding up a stroller, carrying your groceries. It's horrible. So this e-grocery home delivery could be a good option for people in that situation. I loved this quote. It is important that new technologies not be used simply as a means of controlling the behavior of those on welfare, but rather to be used positively as a means for enabling and empowering those with low incomes and consequently to produce greater equity in society. So I'm going to come back to that. Yep, we'll talk about it now. So who is likely to adopt this service? According to the USDA survey, 2008, only those with incomes over 30,000 were even interested on doing anything that would go beyond their lowest grocery cost. In $2020, that's $36K. And in fact, income is still the strongest determinant of digital access. It's pretty striking, 23% of households with incomes under 30 do not have access to the internet. But as far as money goes, there were people using Lyft or Uber to get rides to grocery stores, and the grocery delivery fees strike a middle ground between being more expensive than public transit, but less expensive than taking Lyft or Uber or a TNC company. Another barrier to e-grocery is if you are banked or not. So according to the FDIC, 6.5% of Americans are not fully banked. And you can see that minority groups will be either 3 times to 4 times that rate of occurrence, which is concerning. And there still may be some attitudes that like, oh, how necessary is it that e-grocery home delivery for all? And this was what was being said about digital access in general in 2001, comparing it to a Mercedes divide. But obviously, as social norms do shift, once they're considered to be norms, they're no longer luxury goods. Something to consider. Lastly, it is impossible to know how these service areas will change. Right now, they have definitely expanded their service areas past the urban core, and people are figuring out and pretty excited. And I'll conclude by saying that of everybody living in a low-income, low-access area, 91.1% of those folks would now have options to a home delivery service, and as well as 99.6% of the overall population in our area. So actually pretty good coverage. But again, the likelihood of disadvantaged groups to actually adopt the service is still contingent on other equity gains in our society. Well, let's see that. This research has been funded by the Freight Modeling Research Institute. I'd like to send my thanks to Dr. Pugliosi, Trek, Kat, and PSU Civil Engineering Department. Thanks.
We have a couple minutes. If there's a question, I'll go to the room first. Questions? Yes.
Can you tell us about your process of testing points for locations?
Yeah, in spite of calling a couple companies and asking them if they had maps, and they didn't say no. Luckily, most of the companies just had zip code basis, and that was freely available on their websites. There's only 312 zip codes in our study area, so I just tested all of them. And then again, with Walmart not having that resolution, trying about 512 addresses and just mapping out like, okay, they're here, they're not here. It's still a private industry, so they guard their secrets. But yeah, now there's some maps that you can see things side by side. But it is one of the limits of the research is that it's a snapshot of right now. So we'll see if the large swaths of land in their service areas are sustainable.
As you pointed out, it seems like the groups that could benefit the most from these services, cost is a huge barrier. So I'm just curious, like, was there any indication that these companies like Instacart and Shipt had any intention going into creating these markets to serve those communities, or do they have what is their intention, or do they have any equity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's actually an interesting quote from the Instacart founder, him being like retroactively happy that it was serving visual impaired and disabled communities, and that wasn't his intent, but he was like, oh, well, we'll PR that one up. But yeah, I think, these are tech companies, they're looking for the busy young professionals. And I am pleased that, or I think it's promising and very forward thinking that the supplemental nutritional assistance programs has starting to integrate a pathway for that. And I know that the funds cannot be used on the delivery fees, but before, the cards weren't accepted on the websites at all. So it's the same sort of food eligibility requirements, but sometimes even in low income situations, I think there's all been moments where we've had more money than time, even if we don't have a lot of money. So I think it's great that there's an option, especially for emergency situations. And I would say that Instacart waives a Costco membership fee. So for someone and they don't require membership themselves. So I thought that was very interesting and potentially taking down a barrier for a grocer that's known to provide good value. Thanks for the question.
Great,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
When people online are they just seeing they see what the slides, or they're seeing that
They see that
you as well? Okay, so
Slides,
is it better, like, will they be able to see the presentation better kind of off of those?
As long as you stay in one spot.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it's going like this.
There's 2 screens, so your slides are always on
So
one.
they can,
And
okay,
then the
great.
cameras.
Perfect. You need to be done here for this, the thing for this tour. Great.
The presentation. You.
Let's get that. There we go. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and get to talk to you all today. My name is Gabby Abuzad. I'm a first-year master's student in the Department of Civil Environmental Engineering. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a project I work with Dr. Kelly Clifton in the department. And I'm going to be talking to you about a project that we just worked on for the Portland Bureau of Transportation, looking at freight and travel demand at different multifamily buildings here in Portland, Oregon. So in addition to Dr. Clifton, we also worked closely with Christina Currens, who's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. So they were the two amazing leads on this project. And then the project was funded for the Portland Bureau of Transportation, looking at this information. So the project had two objectives. The first was to inform transportation system development charges for multifamily housing. I'm not going to focus too much on this objective during this presentation, but I think it's important to talk just a little bit about it because I think it contextualizes the work as a whole. And so we wanted to contribute some new data for transportation system development charges. So when new development goes up, we like to think about the impact it's going to add onto our existing transportation infrastructure. And this project starts with the process of trip generation, where we're estimating the number of trips that a new development is going to bring into the system. So we're answering the question of what demand is this new development going to be bringing on. Historically, we've used the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Handbook and Manual to do this. These have been largely criticized for a number of reasons, but they historically have been focused on vehicle travel, so how many cars are moving versus the people within them who are actually doing the traveling. And there's also been a lack of focus on other modes that aren't just vehicles. The data is also insensitive, or historically has been insensitive to urban context and socio-demographics of the region that you're using them in. And so as a result of this, one of the ways that cities are trying to address the discrepancies here is by collecting their own localized data on trip generation within the city to get a more accurate assessment of what travel looks like in the city. So that was one of our objectives. The second one, and the one that I'll be focusing on primarily today, was to inform understanding of and planning for urban freight demand. And so we were interested in looking at the frequency of freight, what types of packages and what types of goods are being delivered, and then by what modes. We were interested in looking at the relationship between these deliveries that were happening and overall person travel, and then extrapolating that information to make suggestions for curb space utilization, to look at efficiencies of multifamily housing, and some other aspects there. So this is a question that a lot of cities are asking, given the rise of the e-commerce sector. Not too long ago, Amanda Howell gave a great presentation on the rise of e-commerce and the impacts that that is having on urban transportation systems. So that if you're interested in this sort of thing, I think her talk is a great reference if you want to go back and watch that on the Trek website. But we're in a day and age where we can quickly and easily and cheaply order any kind of good that we want to be delivered straight to our doorstep. And that has implications for our travel, because if we can have something delivered to us, maybe we don't have to go out and get that thing. So maybe that's a trip we don't have to make. Or maybe if I don't have to go to the grocery store, I can go downstairs and leisurely get a coffee in my building, make a different type of trip. And so this is a big question that cities are asking, because obviously it's having a really profound impact on our transportation system, on curb space, on parking, on all of these things. So we ended up collecting person counts and vehicle counts. So these are coordinate counts. So if someone crossed the doorway into a building or drove their car into a garage or driveway at one of our buildings, they got tallied up. And we also surveyed. So the survey captured information about what mode people were traveling by, and also some information about their deliveries, if they lived at the building, how many people were traveling with them. We collected counts and administered surveys from 7 in the morning to 9 p.m. at night at 12 different developments. Typical trip generation analysis tends to focus on the peak hours, so around 7 to 10 in the morning, 4 to 7 in the evening, because this is when we tend to see the most person travel corresponding with when people are going to and from work. We expanded that to look at a full day, because we hypothesized that when freight delivery was happening, wasn't necessarily going to align with when people were traveling. And so in order to really accurately assess freight demand at these developments, we wanted to look across the whole day. That has some implications for the labor involved in this project, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But we collected data at 12 total sites at around 1,500 units and 1,700 bedrooms. So lots of information. You can see the spread of our sites here. So overall, this corresponded to around 7,500 people that were counted and just around 1,400 vehicles. We collected around 2,900 surveys 861 of those came from residents who gave us information about their deliveries in the past week. So we asked them, in the past week, how many times did you order a packaged parcel or other good? How many times did you order prepared food, like from a restaurant? Or how many times did you order groceries to have them delivered to you? And then we had 160 surveys of delivery personnel, which we are pretty sure is close to the complete census of delivery trips that happened at all of our sites. So looking across some site characteristics, the majority of our sites are more recent builds. I think all of them except one was built in the past 5 years or so. So they reflect this kind of new typology of urban development. 3 of them did not have parking, and those that did have parking had reduced parking. So there wasn't a 1-to-1 ratio of parking spaces to units at any of our developments. But that's kind of in line with cities moving away from having really strict parking minimums. There were smaller unit sizes. The majority of our buildings were comprised of mostly studios and 1-bedrooms. We had a mix of developments that were mixed use and that were not. And then over on the right there, you can see of the total people that we counted, which is a complete census of activity at each site, how many of those people did we survey? So you can see the range of kind of response rates of the survey there, and given typical response rates to mail-out surveys or surveys of any kind, we were pretty happy that we saw this level of response during our study. So one really key thing about the survey was that we wanted to be able to characterize on-site versus off-site vehicle travel. And so in order to do that, we asked a question about parking. So if someone indicated to us that they drove on their trip, so we intercepted people as they were coming and going to ask them about their current trip. So people may have been surveyed throughout the day more than once because we were interested in every single trip they made to their often annoyance. But if they indicated that they were going to be driving or they had driven on that trip, we asked them about parking. So was their vehicle parked on site or off site? So was it parked in the dedicated residential parking there? Did they park on the street or somewhere else? And so this allowed us to separate out those surveys where people had parked on site, and we could use the rest of the surveys then and apply those to our overall person counts to develop estimates for mode share and off-site mode share specifically for vehicles, which provides us some novel and useful information. So looking at daily overall mode share, this is for travel overall. I'll get into mode share for deliveries in a little bit here. Some things to note, walking comprised the greatest of any category in terms of mode share, the greatest percentage, which is great to see from a active transport and sustainability and walkability standpoint. You can see the on-site motorized vehicles comprise about 20% of all trips, but then off-site motorized vehicles comprise around 31%, and together they made up a majority of trips that were happening at the site. Now, in usual trip generation analyses, we focus on on-site impacts. We're capturing trips that come onto the site, onto dedicated residential parking there, not around and on the street. And so if we had done that, we would have missed a significant portion of vehicle travel that was happening at all of our sites. So adding them together, you see it makes up the majority, but if we had only captured on-site, we would be missing a huge portion of that impact. And so I think that has implications for when we're looking at evaluating how well we're doing in terms of reducing auto use and reducing auto dependency in line with climate or sustainability goals, that we really have to think about not just site level impacts, but kind of neighborhood district level impacts and connecting those two things. Other interesting things to note, bus was more popular mode, looking at the transit mode split. And then within our vehicle mode shares, people's personal vehicles were the majority of the modes used in there. Then looking at some parking and on-site, off-site vehicle travel characteristics, you can see that we have three sites that did not have parking. And you can see that those sites still have pretty significant proportions of off-site vehicle travel relative to the number of people that lived in the building. And so again, with this new typology of urban development, and cities are starting to think of kind of relaxing their parking minimums or not requiring parking at all, we still are seeing that even in buildings that don't have parking, people are making lots of trips by car. And so that means that they're parking somewhere else. And so again, thinking about not just the site, but the site's relationship to the neighborhood and characterizing the overall landscape of parking on the neighborhood and district level is really important as we move forward to evaluate policies and see how well we're doing in terms of meeting goals of reducing auto use, reducing auto dependency. Looking at distribution of time for both passenger and delivery travel, the y-axis here is the proportion of trips relative to each category, so they're not absolute numbers, but just so you can see the distribution of those trips across the day. So you can see in these gray areas that person travel, we kind of see the characteristic peaks in the morning and in the evening. And these are the kind of time frames that trip generation analysis typically focuses on. But then you can see that the majority of delivery trips are happening outside of these peak hours. So again, thinking about impact, if these delivery trips are making up a significant portion of travel at these developments, and if we are going with methods to characterize impacts that only focus on the peak hour, we're missing a significant portion and unique portion of travel at these developments, and not fully assessing impact on the transportation system that new development brings, especially as the e-commerce sector and deliveries continue to rise. We did see some differences in terms of time of day that things were delivered, depending on what kind of good was being delivered. The most interesting of which is that prepared food peak that kind of happens at the end of the day. So people might get home from work, and that's when they decide they want to have their Postmates to the comfort of their home. I know that I do that a little too often. It's very convenient, and I love it. So that was kind of interesting to see. And then things like groceries or letters, packages, or parcels tended to be delivered more in the middle of the day while people were out and about at work. Then looking at the mode share of delivery trips. So what was interesting here is that personal vehicles, so people's personal cars or pickups or SUVs, comprise the single greatest share of any category of delivery trips that we saw at these developments. Compared to vans or delivery vans, so think of like the Amazon Prime vans you see pretty often around town, or delivery trucks like the big USPS or UPS freight trucks. And so this is really interesting in thinking about curb space utilization and thinking about what delivery drop-off zones might be. Because instead of a couple spaces for giant delivery freight trucks, maybe what we need is smaller spaces for more compact vehicles. If we're seeing the rise of the gig economy and different types of goods that are being delivered, we could have drop-off spaces that fit smaller vehicles. And those might be really dynamic spaces. They could not only be used for deliveries, but also for things like TNC, so rideshare, Lyft and Uber pickup. And they could also be thinking again about the relationship between the site and the neighborhood. Maybe you have neighborhood level pickup and drop-off zones that are locationally efficient that would allow delivery drivers to deliver at multiple buildings from one succinct kind of drop-off point. That might reduce people having to circle around and look for parking. And so this piece was really interesting and something that we want to continue to look into in future studies. Then from surveys of people, we asked them, the residents in the building, how many times they ordered different types of goods in the past week. You can see that packages, parcels, and other goods were the most popular, averaged across our sites. It came out to about 1.6 package deliveries per unit per week, and then 0.5 for prepared food and 0.3 for grocery deliveries. On their own, these numbers might not look that big or important, but when we scale up to the level of the site, so on average, our developments had around 130 units. This translates to around 208 packages, 65 prepared food, and 30 grocery deliveries, 39 grocery deliveries every week. And then if we just average those across 7 days, that's around 45 deliveries per day. And so if all of those are happening by individual trips, that was a substantial portion of travel. That means that all of these, if these are all coming in vehicles, they need to find somewhere to park at these developments. This is a significant travel impact that we would have missed only focusing on the typical peak hour and not looking at freight trips. Now, do these things happen just in all individual deliveries? No. So when people, when delivery personnel came to deliver things like packages, They often had big carts full of lots of packages for lots of addresses at those developments. And so there was a higher ratio of what was reported by residents being delivered than what we actually observed at the site. And so we guess that there's some efficiency in terms of multifamily buildings there, with delivery drivers being able to deliver to multiple addresses at once. We also saw this pattern with prepared food and groceries. So we're still looking into what that means, whether people are over-reporting or whether it was an unusual week, or how those might actually be operating efficiently. So just some key findings and conclusions so far. The mix of modes across sites was diverse, again, with walking being a major mode of transportation used at these developments. Impacts go beyond the site and beyond the peak hour. So we found a substantial number of vehicle trips were off-site vehicle trips. So these were people that weren't using the dedicated residential parking for these developments. And so that has implications for people being parked on the street, parking landscape on the neighborhood level. And then with the mix of modes being diverse and impacts going beyond the site, we think about curb utilization and what delivery drop-off points or zones might look like in the future as e-commerce continues to rise. And then data collection methodologies require some attention. So Kelly and Mike and George, everyone who helped us out can tell you that surveying people for 14 hours a day at apartment buildings is probably not the best way to get information from people. Super labor intensive, and because of that, we only have the capacity to do so many sites, in addition to trying to get developers and property managers to agree to let us pester their residents for 14 hours a day. So that really limited our sample size. So to the extent that we can rethink how we might collect this super important information and maybe increase reliance on technology and see what technology can do to help us in that area is an area for future research. More future research, we are now looking at comparing passenger travel and freight demand by different locational characteristics of where our buildings are, continuing to examine impacts for curb utilization, and then linking site to neighborhood level impacts of things like parking and freight demand and travel is something that our group is continuing to look at. A great many acknowledgements for this project, the entire team at PBOT who championed this and helped us out. We worked with 2 different staffing agencies, Galt Foundation and DPI, really closely with Gail Lawson and her team at DPI, who were amazing. ULI, the Urban Land Institute, connected us with developers, all of the developers who agreed and property managers who agreed to let us come pester all their residents for 12 hours a day. There are a great number of students and people on our team that helped us with data collection. So Mike and George and Darshan, thank you so much for helping us in our effort. And with that, I will open it up to questions. You can find more about our research group, Dr. Kelly Clifton's research group, at this link here. And you can email me here with any questions. And thank you so much.
We have time for questions. We'll go first to the room.
For the off-site vehicles, I'm curious how far away from the development you track that. Like, how long did you watch someone walking before you decided if they were going to a car or not?
Yes, so this is the importance of the survey. So we didn't track it. We just asked people. We would have loved, so we don't know, and that would be something really interesting to find out, right? Because there's a kind of a sweet spot in the survey of like getting as much information as you can, but also the fewer questions there are, the more likely people are to talk to you. And so we didn't get a sense of how far away they had actually parked, but just that they hadn't parked there at the development. It would be really interesting to track things like that, or especially for freight deliveries, to track kind of where they parked, and that's something that we have thought about potentially for future studies. But yeah, so that would be something super interesting and shows the value of the survey and being able to ask people questions, because we would miss that information if we did.
How do you select those 12 sites? That's my first question. My second question is, do you have information on the social demographic characteristics of the residents? One of your future work is looking at the locational characteristics and link that to the delivery trips. I wonder whether it may also be very interesting if you have the social demographic characteristics of the residents, and then how would that connect to the delivery, the grocery, food, and whatnot? So.
Yes, two great questions. The 12 sites, we had a couple different criteria. We wanted them to be open to residents for more than a year, so people's travel patterns normalize. We wanted them to be close to full occupancy. But other than that, we really wanted to capture a variety of mixed use and not mixed use, parking and not parking. We tried to vary by unit size. But I think the biggest constraint was who would agree to let us do this at their development. And so I spent lots of the summer cold calling developers and property managers and saying, hey, can we come survey your residents for 14 hours a day? And more often than not, people said no. So the kind of biggest constraint was who let us come to collect their development. And with regard to the second question, we don't have that information, at least on the disaggregate, like of the actual residents. We do have information about the rent. And so we can connect it that way. I think it would be interesting to pull some more aggregate information for the region and look at the different neighborhoods and characteristics across neighborhoods, because especially with the utilization of deliveries and having things delivered, we imagine that will have a pretty great impact. A lot of these are new developments, and especially the ones in downtown are very expensive to live at. And these are the ones where we tended to see lots of food deliveries happening. There was one observation of like a pet taxi. Someone came to like put their dog in a car. It was a dog trip that we didn't know how to count that. It was a little weird. So yes, we don't have that information. It would be really valuable to have, and we want to see how we might incorporate the more aggregate measures of that census or data to connect.
Can you comment at all on whether or not those transportation system development charges were in line with what you found in your study?
I won't, because I want the city to be able to do with that, what they're going to do with that before I comment on them. But they're taking a look at everything right now.
I think you mentioned when you were talking about curbside management and parking and potential creation of drop-off spaces. What's interesting about the gig economy drivers is that they don't have a commercial license and don't have those privileges. And those things cost money, so this would be another out-of-pocket cost for a driver if there was such a special license made for independent contractor delivery. I guess my question is, did you see any of these new developments? Did they have built-in reserve drop-off pickup zones? Or are people just throwing on the hazards and doing what they need to do? What sort of parking behavior did you witness?
Yeah, so most of them did not. A couple of them kind of had spaces that were kind of behind the building where drivers could kind of easily pull in and park there. But the majority of them, and none of the ones that I was collecting data at, had dedicated space. And so people had to find parking, presumably. Sometimes you would see them like come and park right in front of the development, but when that wasn't available, we would have to intercept them and talk to them about what their mode was, because they were walking else. Does that answer your question? So I think that's the value of having these more dynamic spaces that can be used as kind of temporary drop-off points, not just for deliveries, but for people as well with rideshare. Yeah. So that way, people without commercial vehicles or commercial license working in the gig economy for delivery still have access to those kind of temporary spaces.
Yeah, and obviously if there wasn't data or study on it before, there would be no numbers to justify such an investment of space. So.
Exactly. Yes.
Because I don't remember, and you've looked at this more recently than I have, how did our total person trip generation vehicle rate compare to IT?
Lower.
So even with, so this is just the point, because I love to bring up this point about ITE trip generation. So we have this huge proportion of trips that wouldn't have been counted in ITE. So those off-site trips wouldn't have been included in their numbers. Yet, even when we have a more comprehensive accounting of that activity, ITE would have still predicted more vehicular demand than we're seeing at these sites, so.
Yes.
It's my
Yes, yes, even accounting for offsite, onsite plus offsite vehicle trips, which like we were able to capture both of those. IT would focus on onsite. Even like the addition of those, what we observed here were substantially less than IT's vehicle trip rates. So if those rates had been used to assess these developments, inaccurate, that translates to inaccurate fees, inaccurate mitigations, all of the things. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
Less even in terms of accounting for any sort of, for lack of a better word, factor of safety in those numbers?
Oh, like buffer?
Right, like the IT were substantially lower, but substantially lower within like some reasonable bound. That's not even what you were seeing?
No, like substantially lower.
Okay.
substantially unreasonable.
Unreasonable, yeah. Yeah.
All right, we are about at our time, so I want to thank both of our speakers. Before we thank them formally, with a nice other round of applause, I want to let everyone know our next seminar happens in 2 weeks, February 28th, and the topic is the Southwest Corridor Light Rail Project. So we'll get some updates on that from Fiona Cundy from TriMet and Patrick Sweeney from PBOT. So hope to see some of you there either in person or online. So thank you again, both to Catherine and Gabby, for excellent work.
Thank you.